Earl, a life well lived. At 99 years of age, Earl Ingebrigt didn't feel his eyesight was sharp enough to be driving a car on the highway. But when it came to his tree farm, that was a different story. Earl had no trouble jumping into his Kubota and zipping through the cedars on his 75-acre farm. It was during his time as an inspector in Washington that Earl bought some land near Granite Falls. It was beautiful and peaceful and a perfect place to get away with his family on the weekends. Earl bought the tree farm in 1958, but he had another reason.
I hate to admit it, but the reason for buying this property was to avoid being called at all odd hours as an inspector. So this property had no telephone, and it was an opportunity for me and my family to be together for a weekend or whatever the time was. And if they wanted me, they could come out and get me.
Life was good, but it was challenging in his younger years. Earl was born on September 21st, 1917, before the U.S. entered World War I. When Earl Ingebrigt was in high school in Seattle, Washington, the Great Depression hit. It was a difficult time for Earl's family.
They lost their home, they lost their car, and we had to move in with my grandmother.
It was also tough on Earl. Work was scarce and jobs were tough to come by. But in 1935, he got his first job.
I worked for him at $1 a day.
He also had his own version of driver's ed when his boss asked him to pick up some supplies.
That's where I first drove a car. And I'd never driven a car before, but this guy had a Model A Ford. And I discovered that car didn't have very good brakes.
But Earl had a girlfriend, Laureen, who later became his wife, and $1 a day wasn't cutting it. Laureen's father was a railway post office clerk and encouraged Earl to take the post office exam.
An exam came up in 1936, I believe, and there were thousands of people applying for the post office because of the Depression. 65 cents an hour. I think it was $1,900 a year.
He got a position in the Seattle Post Office. One of the early highlights during Earl's postal career was seeing Postmaster General James A. Farley visit Seattle. It made quite an impression on the young postal employee.
We were told that James A. Farley, the Postmaster General, was going to come into Seattle. And as he drove by, I was looking out the window and he looked right at me and waved. I knew he was waving at me. I was quite impressed, to tell you the truth. I thought, maybe this is where I belong, in the post office.
Interestingly enough, Earl and James A. Farley met again almost 30 years later in New York.
So I was sitting on the platform there, overlooking the audience, and lo and behold, here was James Farley. He was the principal speaker, and I never thought I'd ever see him again, But when it came my turn to speak, I told him about this situation back when I was first an employee of the postal office there. And he was so taken with that. He was very impressed.
In 1951, Earl applied to become a postal inspector.
I always enjoyed reading detective novels.
The competition and testing was beyond belief.
I found that there was an opportunity to work for the inspectors as a detail. I applied for it and was hired.
And that wasn't all. Politics were involved back then.
They tried to balance everything out. They tried to make an equal between Democrat and Republican. In those days, it was not so easy to become an inspector.
But Earl found out the job wasn't exactly like the detective novels he thought it would be. He learned how to be an inspector on the job. There was no training academy to attend.
In those days, it was on the job within the division. Inspectors were expected to wear suits, not slacks and sport coats, suits. And the thing that really was the crowning glory was that you had to wear a hat.
Inspector Ingebrigt worked all types of cases, but was particularly intrigued by fraud investigations. The job of postal inspector involved lots of long hours, and in a large division like Seattle, a lot of travel.
With the fraud assignment, I did a lot of traveling. California and here and there.
Inspector Ingebrigt's management career started in 1966 when he was named inspector in charge of the Seattle Division.
Oh, the people I was working with were great. I enjoyed very much. Had good cooperation, and I think we did a good job.
Then it was on to San Francisco.
The chief called up and said, I want you to be inspector in charge in San Francisco. San Francisco was the best 2 years of my life as an inspector. It's a great place.
In 1971, the chief inspector asked him to go to New York and set up this new management level, the regions. He became the first regional chief inspector for the New York Metro region.
The chief says, you go back to New York and establish an office for regional chief inspector, which I did. Fortunately, I had good help back there. I had some great people working for me, and I could never have done it if I hadn't had good help, real good help.
It was a big change for the Ingebrigts, but was embraced by his wife, and they moved to the East Coast for the first time.
You couldn't ask for a better wife, and she was willing to do whatever had to be done to advance my career. She was just great.
And then in 1973, it was time for the new regional chief and his wife to enjoy retirement. They moved back to the Pacific Northwest and the Valhalla Tree Farm, which Earl managed for over 40 years. He was named Washington's Tree Farmer of the Year in 2010. Earl has a few words for those who are just coming into the inspection service.
Making the most of what your opportunities are. I think you will have a great time in your life.
And for those in management.
Recognize the abilities of people that are working for you or with you, and are able to give them the opportunities that they need to grow and do their job well.
Earl Ingebright, father, husband, grandfather, postal inspector, and friend to many, passed away just a few weeks short of his 100th birthday. His life was a life well lived.